Thank you all for coming. This is the last of our enlightening lunches of the academic year. It seems improbable that it has happened so quickly. But we have gone through a lot of intellectual space in the enlightening lunches. And as you know, the theme of them has been the sort of large group of research centers around the university whose work is allied in some serious ways with the work that the School for the Future of Innovation Society and particularly the Institute for the Future of Innovation Society are doing. Today it's my pleasure to introduce Klaus Lackner, who is going to be telling you without the benefit of PowerPoint, so don't anticipate seeing anything there, other than perhaps his shadow, about the Center for Negative Carbon and the work that he's doing there that is, I think, in the opinion of very many people, including me, one of the really interesting and hopeful prospects for technological fixes in the world. We're often very skeptical of them, but the sort of necessity, perhaps, of negative carbon is really causing, at least in my mind, some need for hope in that direction as well. And I think Klaus is part of one of the hopeful dialogues about climate.
So thank you for the introduction. Yes, indeed, I decided not to have a PowerPoint. I have PowerPoints exactly on the topic, but then you become tied to your PowerPoint, and I think this is a lunch group where we could actually interrupt, ask questions as we go. So I'd be much more comfortable doing that if I don't have a bunch of PowerPoints stacking up behind me and I have to follow them. So I think in this group, I don't have to do all that much to convince you that climate change is real. I would point out that the underlying physics is actually fairly simple. That was understood already by Fourier, who wrote about it in 1824, that the atmospheres of planets and their way they absorb light will affect the temperature of the planet. Arrhenius in 1898 could tell you what climate change will do if we double CO2 in the atmosphere. He pretty much got that right by now, nearly 120 years ago. And so I would also argue that if you look at the IPCC's reports and you particularly pay attention to the integrated assessment models, I think in many ways they underestimate the risks. The models become too simple, they hide risks, they sweep it under the rug because they eventually get quite smooth, but they nevertheless pose a rather serious problem for you, because what they argue is that give or take, the CO2 emissions and their impact on temperature are essentially cumulative and linear in what you add, which is a little bit surprising because some of it will actually go away, and they say that's canceled by the fact that the ocean warms up, and it should be logarithmic rather than linear. And they say, but somehow or another, the ocean's ability to pick it up is not quite constant, and as a result, that cancels out. So give or take, for the next few hundred years, if we keep adding CO2, we can simply add where we are on the curve. And we probably have reached a warming of 1.1 degrees, so we have 0.4 to go before we hit 1.5 degrees, and 0.9 to go as we would reach 2-degree warming. And that, if you work it out, would get us to somewhere around 500 ppm. But that's sort of a 50-50 proposition too. If you say, I want to be safe on it, the IPCC actually in its latest report said, if you want to keep the likelihood of not crossing 2 degrees low, then you should stay below 450 ppm of CO2 in the atmosphere. And actually, in their footnote, they say very clearly the ppm equivalent. So they count the other greenhouse gases too. You can sit down with a calculator, look up in the tables what those numbers are, and you find that we crossed 450 ppm equivalent a couple of years ago. So we are above that number already. So in many ways, I would argue we are already possibly in an overshoot. If you believe Jim Hansen, we are in an overshoot since 350 ppm. If you look at standard wisdom a decade ago, it was 450 ppm. We are right now 17 years away from it, and we are still accelerating in the amount of CO2 coming out rather than slowing down. So I have a very hard time believing that we could even figure out, even if we did everything we could, to prevent hitting that guardrail. And if you now look at the more recent discussions, I think people are giving up on the 450 and say, you know, if we get to 500 ppm, we still have a 50-50 chance that we got away with it. Now, if I told you go home and you find a 30% chance that your house burned out, you probably would rush off right now and check out what really happened. So, but for the planet as a whole, we seem to take 50-50 as a pretty good odds. So my view is the overshoot is baked in. You can do a back of the envelope calculation. You say, let's not think in carbon emissions, let's think of carbon intensity and allow the world to grow roughly 3% a year, which is sort of what it has done. And we like to lower the carbon intensity every year, the carbon per unit of GDP, every year by a fixed percentage. And we would like to scoot in over below 450 ppm, and I'll give you 4 gigatons of carbon per ppm, which says half of it went into the ocean and the biosphere. And you find out, last time I did it about a year ago, you needed 8.5% annual reduction in carbon intensity worldwide in perpetuity, and you would not breach 450. I find what's really disconcerting is every year you do that, this goes up by 2 or 3, 0.2, 0.3%, because simply the budget is getting smaller and the baseline from which you start is getting larger. You start with a higher emission rate and the remaining budget gets smaller. But you can figure all of this out, so I think we actually can't help that anymore. My personal view is we are trying to go about the problem right now in not the optimal way. We are saying we need to mitigate, we have to come up with ways of slowing down when we're already in an overshoot situation. And I think a much better paradigm to think in, one is to say we have a budget, and that budget is running very, very low right now. One of the problems with setting a budget is that we are, of course, somewhat uncertain how much we can put out. So it's like the old American Express. Well, it doesn't have an explicit limit, but try to put a $100,000 Ferrari on it and see what would happen. Right? So whether they just say, okay, you have no limit, let's go for it. So we don't really know exactly what the limit is, but I would argue even better way of thinking about it, rather than we have to balance a budget and eventually go negative because we already overspend our budget, is to think of it as a waste management problem. And I think you see immediately that this is actually quite different from what we actually do if I actually simply phrase my problem for real garbage, right? So you wouldn't like me as your neighbor if I just happily put my sewage or my garbage out in the street. You might call the cops on me, and I'm going to tell you, you know, you should actually praise me for what I did, because last year it was 20% more than it is this year. So I'm getting better all the time, and I'm mitigating my garbage problem. So don't complain. And quite the contrary, we're doing good things here. Or even worse, I say, you know, I found some place in another town where the garbage disposal is a lot cheaper than here. So don't you mind my putting my garbage out here, I'll pay for the garbage removal over there. So I'm arguing, if you think about it as a waste management problem, it becomes actually a very different way of thinking about it. And so from that perspective, I would argue, you can actually make that quite simple conceptually. Because if you start thinking about it, what is the garbage? Well, it's not carbon in the atmosphere. We want 200, 300, 350 ppm, some number like this in the atmosphere, but it's the excess carbon, right? We are digging up fossil carbon from the ground, and roughly half of that will stay with us for centuries, and the excess in the atmosphere, and the excess will stay in the mobile carbon pool, which I would define as the ocean, the biosphere, and the atmosphere for the next 10,000 to 100,000 years. That's the time scale for geological processes to remove it again. So if you want to deal with that, your waste emission is bringing that carbon to the surface, to mobilize it, to put it out and say, now we are going to do something with it, and 90, 80, 85% of it ends up immediately being combusted, because we wanted it for the energy, and the last little bit is being used because we make plastics out of it, like things like this, right? And so it ends, some fraction ends up in places where it has some residual residence time, but chances are this thing eventually ends up in a waste incinerator. And so with some delay, a large fraction of this will come out too. So to me, the waste is generated the moment it comes out of the ground. And if you were to demand that if you want to do that, you have to put another ton of carbon back into the ground, you could actually balance the books, right? So the understanding has to be, if you want to do it, you have to pay for it, and you have to put it away. And oh, by the way, we have now reached the point where we probably have to go back and look at our old debt and say we have to pull back what carbon which we have to get back, because otherwise we have a problem. Now, what could you actually do that? And if you read the IPCC report, they basically offer only one option. They say, let's collect carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, growing plants, trees, you name it, and now we turn around and burn them in power plants. We collect the CO2, so at least we got the energy from all that woody biomass. We take that, we burn it, we collect the CO2, and now we have to store it underground. Right? And so we end up doing that, and if we do that, we can put a lot of CO2 away, and the integrated assessment model sort of went hog wild on that by growing and growing this and say, look, we can actually do it. If you step back though for a second and ask, how big does this actually have to get in order to do make some serious change? We can ask two questions. One is, we could have the economy keep running on normal fossil fuels, and right now we are putting out 40 gigatons a year, give or take, and so you would have to cancel that. That's a very, very big number. Alternatively, if you said, we will figure out not to use fossil carbon anymore, we are going to renewable energy, we're going to need nuclear energy, we're going to do all of that, but by the time we manage to do this, we are overshot by 100 ppm, which we will have to take back. And we would like to do this in a reasonable amount of time. Now, say 4 decades, 5 decades, if you work it out, we are going up right now 2.5 ppm a year by emitting 40 gigatons. If we come pulling back, the ocean will give back its part too. And so if we want to come back at 2.5 ppm a year, which gives us in 40 years 100 ppm, well, we will have to work on 40 gigatons a year. Now I can turn this around and say, okay, if I do biomass, I know that biomass is limited by the sunshine. I can lay out the area I will have to do agriculture or something akin to agriculture on. And you will find that that agricultural area, whether this is ocean water where you do algae or palm oil plantations, whatever you choose, will be significantly larger than what we currently do. So basically, you would have to build a second agricultural sector next to one we have, which is already under stress, and manage to do that. So early on, I decided, yes, biomass will be a cheap way to get started in this story, but you cannot really ever expect it gets so large that you can play this game. Somewhat facetiously, I had said to students when they asked how great is bioenergy, that the problem is that SUV is a lot hungrier than you. And the other part of it, it actually has more money than most people on the planet have. So you are setting yourself up for a collision course because we are competing for a resource which inherently is limited. And we need more. Put another way, in the US we are consuming about 10,000 watts of primary energy as our industrial processes, but your metabolism, if you work it out, 2,000 kilocalories a day, is about 100 watts. So in essence, the agriculture sector feeds a 100-watt habit per person, and we are now asking it to take on a 10,000-watt habit we have in energy consumption. I think that challenge is nearly unmanageable. So we started out and said we can actually have technical means of collecting CO2 from the atmosphere, and we would expect to get significantly faster than a tree, because I can plausibly build you a device which we call an artificial tree, where I have surfaces which bind CO2, and if the wind blows through, I can actually measure a difference between CO2 in front and behind that tree, this artificial tree. So I can do things much more concentrated than a natural tree would do, a real tree would do. And so our goal is to build devices which can actually collect carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. I think there's no doubt that that can be done, because if you run an air liquefaction plant today, you make liquid air, and by cooling the air down this much, any water vapor which is in the air and any CO2 which is in the air will turn solid. And so the gas companies who do make these gases have a long time ago already figured out that they have to strip all the CO2 out of the air and all the water vapor before they make it liquid, because otherwise you get sand in your liquid air, and they can't handle that very well. So the bottom line is, technologies to do this have been around forever. Every submarine has to do it, every spacecraft has to do it. The question is, can we get the cost to a level that is affordable? And that's what we are working on, and I would argue, yes, you can. That is a whole lecture which takes a lot longer than I have time for right now. But to give you a very simple insight, people argued first the thermodynamics doesn't work out. Well, if you put the numbers on the thermodynamics, you need to come up with 22 kilojoules of energy for 1 mole of CO2, but when you made a mole of CO2, you got 700 kilojoules. So there's plenty of room to get that back from a thermodynamics limit. The other argument people have made, all processes are linear in the dilution, which, by the way, is not thermodynamics. Thermodynamics is algorithmic. And we figured out that the reason this is usually true is that the first process of touching everything dominates the cost. And for that reason, we said we are passive. We're standing in the wind just like a tree. We are not paying much to make contact with the CO2 or the air. We are paying for getting the CO2 back off our sorbent. Our particular sorbent is special in that it loves dry air and it binds CO2, and the moment you make it wet, it doesn't like the CO2 anymore, and it releases it. So we can basically stand out in this climate outside in the wind, load up with CO2. When we are done, we put it in an enclosure, and the CO2 comes off. We then can collect it, concentrate it, purify it, and sell it to you. I would argue right now, we are probably, if you let us build a truly engineered system, we are somewhere between $100 to $200 a ton of CO2. There are some small companies out there who actually have claimed, Kleinworks from Zurich, that they are right now $300, $400 a ton of CO2. But we are at the very beginning of a long process. If you start mass producing them and come down the learning curve, like photovoltaics has, like wind has, you quite rapidly will be below $100 a ton. To put this in perspective, at $100 a ton, you would have to pay 85 cents extra on a gallon of gasoline to pay for that, or a gallon of diesel, a gallon of jet fuel. It's all more or less the same. Or if you get down to $30 a ton, which I see as a long-term target and goal, you would have to pay an extra quarter on a gallon of gasoline to pay for it. I don't think you would do it for power plants because it's silly to do it, but you would do it for airplanes, you would do it for heavy trucks, you would do it for ships, and you certainly would have to do it if you wanted to get the CO2 back from the past. And here's a corollary. We may not like geological storage or any form of carbon storage because it's unpleasant, but we already have taken on the debt. We already overcharged. We already past this point. I think the fact that we will need storage at this point is actually not negotiable anymore, because we could have thought of this in 1980 and nothing would have happened. We could have stopped using fossil carbon. If you really have to come back 100 ppm, to put this in perspective, this is 1,500 gigatons, 1,500 billion tons of CO2 to make that happen. Or put yet another way, that is more CO2 than has been emitted between 1900 and 2000, because we raised CO2 in the atmosphere by about 80 ppm at that time, by less than 80, about 70, 80 ppm. Now, the reason that the number is so large is because right now we do this in about 40 years. Right? So we, by the time we stepped on the brakes and come to a stop, we are past this point. So I would argue this is our challenge, and we have to find not only the ability to pull it back, but also to find a place to put it. And you can't say, oh, I can use it again and make gasoline out of it. Fine, that will work. Then you are carbon neutral. But then you didn't change the balance in the atmosphere. We put it in the environment, we became responsible to take it back out. Now, we are also accused in saying this and in doing that we are a moral hazard, right? And we are a moral hazard because people say, well, if you can do that, why bother doing all the other mitigation things? Get better about sustainability and renewable, just keep doing that. I think that argument is also too late, right? We could have made that argument some time ago. I think the picture is changing. We said, well, we have to figure out how to stop and come to a level. Right? By now, we will overshoot. We now have to figure out how to come gracefully back down. And it is not that I'm telling you that this is free, it doesn't cost you anything. To make an analogy, we are going way too fast in this car. And we are going to come in that curve. And there's no question we will hit the guardrail. But at this point, it's a question, will we tear the fender off, or will we roll over and create a complete wreck? That's the question right now at the table. And now I have a passenger in the back seat to gripe a little, who says, but don't touch the brakes. Don't touch the brakes. If people touch the brakes, they are going to drive too fast, right? Right? Because they know they have the brakes, right? That is effectively the moral hazard argument. That I'm arguing the moral hazard argument actually cuts both ways. And I think what you're actually seeing in the moral hazard argument, that we are actually deeply uncomfortable with the idea of having a waste management problem. And the initial response to it is, we want zero waste. And I'll give you that. I give you that in the long term, we want zero waste. But we need to pick up the litter we already created, and we don't have a choice about that. And if we don't do that, we will have a real problem. And so we need to develop technologies like ours, which allows us to pull CO2 back, and technologies which allow us to put it somewhere. And then we have to put somebody in charge to make this happen. And I would argue you want a certificate of carbon removal on the one side. And the first thing you have to say, if you ever dig up a ton of carbon, you better show such a certificate of sequestration. And then we as a society have to take some of these certificates, if not all of them, and tear them up and say you can't have them to bring out fresh CO2, fresh carbon, because you need to get rid of the old carbon. And that's how societies figure out how to do this is a complicated, difficult question. But we have to match it somehow and make it work. And when we do that, we can then start from the top down and say governments will buy these things and put them away. Or we could start from a voluntary level on the other end, right? But then again, you have to make the story palatable, right? If you say this is ugly waste disposal, and you much rather have clean carbon, I'm still going to the pump and put gasoline in my car. And maybe I would actually push the button and say, I'll pay 50 cents extra for this gallon of gas, and in return, you either gave me gasoline which came from biomass, or was synthetically made, or you gave me gasoline which doesn't have it, and maybe if I'm in a really good mood, I write a charitable check to put a few hundred tons of carbon dioxide on it, right? But you need to figure out how to get that started, unless you think this can't be done. We have done this with recycling, right? This actually truly was a grassroots effort. And the other thing is people routinely pay money for clean energy. So I think all of these things put together, we actually have a fair chance to do this, and I think on the corporate level, it's actually starting. There are companies who want to be sustainable, and the problem this field has is that because it's waste management, rather than true sustainable energy, you are looked at askance and say, well, you don't fit into this discussion, right? So I think that's where we have to get a little more open-minded about it, and at some level, it's extremely hard to deal with the last ton of carbon, so we have to come to the point of view that there has to be some carbon waste management. And beyond that, I'm all for saying, let's figure out how to avoid making waste in the first place. And I think an energy system which becomes more and more renewable will solve this problem. And by the way, direct air capture has a big role to play in that either, because I think this is where a large fraction of the storage problem will be solved. Because if you talk about 5 to 10 minutes, a battery is an excellent way of storing electricity and giving it back. But the capital cost of that battery is quite high. And if you sit on this battery for a weekly cycle or an annual cycle, because you are storing energy from the summer for the winter, the capital cost of that battery is unaffordable. But you can make chemicals. You can make hydrogen via electrolysis and convert that hydrogen with CO2 into, let's say, methanol or diesel, and you can sit on this for a year without incurring much cost, and therefore then keep using it in that world. So the air capture technologies we are developing are equally happy in a waste management system as they are in a closed cycle where carbon is only used where it's interesting and allows you now to recycle carbon that came from the air and goes back to the air in every cycle. I think I'll spend my time. I'd be more than happy to answer questions.
What percentage, the carbon cycle annually, CO2 comes in and out of these various places, the ocean, etc. What is mankind's contribution on an annual basis to the volume of all the carbon cycle?
That's a very interesting question, and it's actually a fairly small number. And I was some years ago, I was challenged by an outfit who clearly wanted me to say, we are so small we don't matter, and I'm arguing otherwise. There are roughly, in round numbers, roughly 200 gigatons of carbon, which slosh back and forth every year between the ocean and the atmosphere and the atmosphere and the biomass. So that's that number. We are talking about 10 gigatons. The argument I made to people, I said, if you look at it, these movements back and forth are extremely well balanced. Right? There is carbon going into biomass, creating leaf litter every year, and the leaves then are decaying again, and those things are perfectly balanced. So what I'd argued is, if you keep drinking for a year, and it turns out you have 1% off, or 10% off, which is sort of the numbers we are talking about, 5% actually. If you have 5% off at what you take in and take out, at the end of the year, you're going to feel horrible, right? Or if your income versus your checking account, if there's a monthly thing going in, and every month you spend 5% more. So what you see is, you see these big swings. For example, if you're in Hawaii, you see 3 ppm parts per million, it shoots up. In the winter, it drops back down below the average by 3 ppm, so there's a 6 peak-to-peak swing every year. And if you calculate that, that's 25 ppm per year if this slope would keep going, right? But it goes back and forth and back and forth. We overlaid this with a 2.5 uptick every year, and that's us. That's that 10 gigatons we are putting in, right? And that 10 gigatons of carbon we add, right? That causes us to go up 2.5 ppm. Now, the 200 gigatons going in and out are much bigger, but they are balanced. If you ask what we are balanced against, it's geological weathering, which is a tiny fraction of a gigaton. So we have put the system out of balance, and we are creeping up every year. When I started working on it in the 90s, it was like 1.5 ppm a year. By now, it's 2.5 ppm a year, right? And we are still on the accelerator. The CO2 emissions every year, the fuel consumption and CO2 emissions every year are going up, not down. So, and the balance actually, you have to explain where the CO2 went, because roughly half of it stays in the atmosphere. The other half has been taken up by the biosphere in the ocean.
Yeah, here I was drinking carbonated soda, water, and thinking, well, they take energy to make that stuff, to break down water and stuff.
And there's far more CO2 associated with that energy than you just had in your drink.
Yeah, why not have some sort of regulation saying you have to take it out of the, take it somewhere where it creates something good. How much could be done with regulation on things like carbonation and other usages?
Here's your problem. You can do something, but it's small. And to put it in perspective, our CO2 emissions are now jumping from the 10 to nearly 40 because the CO2 is 3.7 times as heavy as the carbon which made it. So if you look at our CO2 emissions, there's 36 to 40 gigatons, depending on what you count, per year. Our consumption of sand and gravel is less than that worldwide. So we are just on a scale which is so fantastically large that using that CO2 is great. In the US, we use what I would call merchant CO2, the kind you just used, something which came in a truck to some plant where they made your carbonated drink, right? That's 8 million tons a year. If you look at enhanced oil recovery, where most of that CO2 came actually from underground somewhere to go back underground somewhere else, that's like 40 million tons a year. If you look at ammonia plants, which make urea, right? In the urea production, we use another 40 million. So if you're generous, the US is consuming 100 million tons of CO2. Most of it, very questionable in this discussion because it's directly fossil carbon. In enhanced oil recovery, it's literally a CO2 well in southern Colorado feeding CO2 into oil wells in West Texas. Right, so it doesn't do you any good from a climate perspective. It's neutral in that sense. But if you look at that 100 million, that's matched with 5.1 billion. It's actually, the 100 million is the round-off error on this number. It's around 5.1, 5.2 billion tons of CO2 we actually emit from fossil fuels. So consumption is on an entirely different scale.
Given what you know from your work and what you know of human behavior, how optimistic are you that we're going to tear a fender off and not turn the car over?
I would argue that depends. If that fender tearing off is a gradual process, gradual enough that it hurts early enough, we'll fix it. If that happens too suddenly, we may very well find ourselves in a situation we cannot manage. So nightmare scenarios people have put up is that we are starting to warm up the permafrost. There's an awful lot of carbon tied up in that permafrost, things which froze at the end of the ice age. Some of it is methane already. And so it starts bubbling out, and then you have a runaway greenhouse effect. And at that point, we may have lost control. So these are the real nightmare scenarios on the one side. And if that happens fast enough, now right now everybody tells you it's not going to be fast enough. So it comes down to these questions. Scott Barrett has done an interesting experiment in my view. He sort of had these game theoretical things where he said, we know exactly when the doomsday clock strikes. You all in playing in this game have to chip in. You can make some small money on this game. And if you all keep your money, you can walk off with it. But if you don't cooperate on this problem and chip something in, you lose everything. And in one version of the game, there was a doomsday clock where they said if it hits 450, game's up, right? And so the participants nearly always fix this. If you instead said there is a growing probability between 400 and 500 that this was your last game, and you only will know after the fact whether this was the last game, they could never solve it. Okay? So, because there's always somebody then who says, well, we can try this once more, right? Because it worked just fine. So let's just try it once more. So if you really need cooperation, you get caught in these games where you can't win. And this is part of the question, how certain are we what will happen when? And the problem is, I'm taking it from a distant point of view. I say, well, sooner or later this will run us over, right? The question is, I can't tell you this will happen on May 25th, 2050, right? So I can't give you, we all could get our act together. Scott pointed that out in his paper too. We all could get our act together on Y2K, even though it probably was immaterial and didn't matter at all. But we spent an awful lot of resources to solve this because we had a very well-defined clock which said, this is when you have to be ready. So we all got ready, right? But here it's sort of a wishy-washy thing. So the question is, will we see it in time? The danger really is there's an inherent delay of about 50 years in this system. In other words, if I could stop CO2 levels in the atmosphere right now and hold it at 410 where we are now, we are 408. So if we could hold it fixed here, the planet for the next 60 years is getting warmer. So by the time you notice that it hurts, you are well above where you should be, which in my view makes it even more important that you have to have technologies which get you out of that mess, right? Because, and I'm not telling you come out of this intact. I'm telling you the alternative of not having the technologies will guarantee the roll.
So do you have an actual working prototype?
We have actual small working prototypes in the lab. We have a slightly bigger one running at Polytech, which is supposed to feed algae, and it may have actually connected to the algae, and it's collecting a little bit of CO2. We are in right now with Salt River Project, having done an engineering design, which is only producing low-grade CO2, like you would feed into a greenhouse, like 5% CO2. And we think that even that version we just laid out, properly engineered, will cost around, will make CO2 at $100 a ton.
And so where are you putting the CO2 that you're getting out of this? Are you putting it in the ground?
Well, that depends. I can take two views on this. The first one is right now we're working on air capture. We have one capture. We play with everybody who can put it away. One group we talk to is we make fuels, right? So if you have excess electricity from a PV panel but nobody wants it, make hydrogen. If you give me hydrogen and CO2, we know since the 1920s how to make fuel out.
So it's not in that scenario that it's not a waste product, it's actually a
in that, yes, but on the other hand, you are not returning back down. So you then hold absolutely level. You took CO2 out of the air, and 3 weeks later the airplane puts it back in, right? So you didn't come back down. If you
but
want
you
to
avoid pumping the oil out of the ground in Saudi Arabia.
yes, but you have you are in debt, and you say I'm going to spend less. That doesn't lower your debt. So to put it another way, I say you guys have to go out and work because you already have debt and you need to have an income to pay it back, right? To say I'm going to spend less than I used to will not lower my debt. It will lower the rate at which my debt is going up, right? And that's what's happening here. You have a carbon budget, and some people say you have 1 trillion tons of carbon, and we have gone more than half of it. I actually think you don't have 1 trillion tons. I think you may only have had a little less than we already spent, maybe a little more than we spent. We can argue where exactly this number is. When I got into it, what convinced me is it doesn't matter where you put the limit. We can go to 2 trillion by the end of the century because we are now operating at a carbon rate of 10 a year. So we are doing in 100 years another 1 trillion tons of carbon at the rate we are going. So we need to sometime this century come to zero. And now it looks like we waited long enough that we probably have to come back down. So if you want to do that, we have to find a place for that carbon. And the oil companies tell you, we know how to do this. We are injecting oil with CO2 in the ground for years and years because we want to get oil out. So Statoil is a company in Norway which has a gas well which happens to produce 10% CO2. It's very common that gas wells, natural gas wells, also have CO2 in it. They never were allowed to sell that mixed gas into the European pipeline system. So they always stripped out that CO2, and then guess what? They put it in the atmosphere, right? And then, because they said, well, we burn that methane in a week from now somewhere in Denmark or in Germany. So what's the big deal? You added 10% to that emission because we did this here. And then the state of Norway said, it's going to cost you $55 a ton of CO2. And I said, okay, then we'll strip it out of the natural gas right on the platform. And there is a big saline aquifer formation, basically seawater, 800 meters below the seafloor, in what is an ancient sandbank, right? And you can pump in fluid into this like nobody's business. And so for the last 20 years, since 1996, so 22 years, they are pumping 1 million tons of CO2 every year into this formation. And it's there, and it has been there. I have advocated in the 1995 in a paper, and I'm still an advocate of it, is carbon dioxide is an acid, carbonic acid. Find yourself a base and make a mineral carbonate. So now we can put calcium carbonate in piles. That is far more expensive, but I ultimately like it better. But in the meantime, I actually came around being positive on these geological sequestrations, not because I particularly well like it, but it takes the excuse away that we don't know what to do. We can do it if we want to, and so then you can put carbon dioxide away. Now you have to find a place where it's safe. Germany has said, not under our backyard. If you want to do it, it has to happen elsewhere. And in the Netherlands, the same discussion happened, and so now the Netherlands say, well, but we can't do it in the North Sea, because nobody lives on top of it. So there are old gas fields in the North Sea, which are now receiving CO2. So Britain is doing the same. So here in this country, we seem to be more relaxed about injecting on land. So there are plenty of places we do it for enhanced oil recovery, because this is where it started in West Texas in the 1970s. They actually said, where in the world are we going to get CO2 from? And then they were drilling a hole in southern Colorado, and because they saw gas, and they drilled into it and said, oh, this is 99.9% CO2. What do we do now? And somebody says, well, with a little bit of a credit from the federal government, we can actually run a pipeline from here to West Texas and sell the CO2 for enhanced oil recovery there. And it's going on ever since. Exxon has an outfit in, I think in Wyoming, which is producing 4 million tons of CO2 a year, which is simply sold outside of Exxon for enhanced oil recovery, all the way up and down the Rocky Mountains.
So is this taking the place of fracking?
No, this is pre-fracking. This is before fracking ever happened. In the fracking industry, they are not that sophisticated yet. They are not interested in CO2 yet, because they need to get the price down, and they still have plenty of stuff. This happens if you start pulling on a well for a long time. Nothing comes out of it. And people say, well, you know, if I pump water in, I can get a little more. And somebody said, if you pump CO2 in, you get even. So there are plenty of gas oil wells in the world which could benefit from that CO2. Now, I'm not telling you that is net total a carbon loss, because you bring more carbon up in that oil than you put in as CO2 you inject. But it shows the principle that you can inject underground, and by the way, that CO2 stays there. Actually, half of it comes back with the oil, but at this point it's so valuable that they strip it out, because it's compressed still, and they re-inject it right away. So after, on average, 2 cycles, that CO2 is gone. Now, they never did a study whether it stays for 10,000 years, because that's not, was never in their interest. So that's a more recent thing that people study it and say, yeah, looks like that in most cases it stays 10,000 years. So yes, there are places you can put the carbon. There's a group in Iceland which injects into the basalt, and they have shown that in about 2 years it's a carbonate.
So what?
It turns into a carbonate. They basically make limestone out of that basalt. And the question is this a little bit of pixie dust caught in the rock, and it reacts very fast. If you put lots of it in, it won't work anymore. They don't know that yet. So the next question is, how much can I actually pump into a well? And so you could imagine places all over the world where CO2 is being put away. And these will probably be drips and drabs on the million-ton-a-year scale, like Statoil. But that's what we do in power plants. A big power plant produces 7 million tons of CO2 a year. 1,000 tons an hour, yes.
What if you became so successful at this and CO2 was so valuable that you sucked the CO2 out of the atmosphere and you lowered it to, say, somewhere where plants wouldn't grow? Would that be
I have a colleague, Peter Eisenberger, who actually has this vision. He says, a lot of people are all wrong about it. Rather than having this doomsday scenario, we should have a positive scenario. He says, we could make as much solar energy as we want, and we'll get dirt cheap. We'll pull CO2 out of the atmosphere, and we build the entire infrastructure out of carbon. Right? And he says, this is a virtuous cycle now. The more economic growth you have, the more carbon you take out, and the lower the CO2 gets. So this could theoretically end up here. Now, I would argue with this, if you're smashingly successful, you say, I can stop now because I'm at 350 parts per million. Because no matter how you think about my version of the story, this is a waste management story, and if you finish getting rid of the pile, then there's no real motivation to keep going. It's first the Canadians who say, you know, I'm not paying for an even colder climate, right? And eventually everybody says, let's stop doing this because it costs us money, because it's never free. But in his scenario, he says, well, we can build bridges out of carbon, we can build planes out of carbon, we can build houses out of carbon, and so, but you need 150 tons of carbon per person in a world with 10 billion people to put 100 ppm away. So even that is sci-fi to argue that we run out. But if you did, you know what? There's plenty of carbon in the world which I can get cheaper than out of the atmosphere. The atmosphere, because it's so diluted, is likely to be the most expensive place. So if you tell me, I don't want fossil carbon because it's dirty, how about limestone? Right? There's plenty of carbon in the world, so if you said we depleted the atmosphere, we are now getting below, we are getting into ice age territory, right? Maybe we should stop. We certainly won't run out of carbon. Carbon is not all that common an element on the planet, but compared to what we use, there are enormous amounts of it. So I think we could always find other carbon, and probably cheaper. And this is where I have trouble with all of this, including what I do. It's always cheaper, I would argue, to ignore the problem. Because if I give you a lump of coal, I guarantee you that was cheaper than getting the equivalent amount of carbon out of the atmosphere. So that waste management service is implicit in all of that. Right? So I need to want to do it and pay a little premium for getting that CO2 from there. And so therefore I actually think this would stop itself, because I'd stop paying the premium. Right? But you can get into arguments where to stop. Right? Some countries may say, long before other countries, that they don't want it any cooler, because they're winners and losers in all of this. And I'm sure you'll get a lobby about saying, you know, that freight route from Tokyo to Rotterdam and New York going straight over the pole is really something worth protecting. Right?
You said earlier that one of the challenges for you is to bring the price down.
Yes.
And I also wonder, is there some system that could be tweaked to speed that up for you, or is there policy changes? How do carbon credits feed into that?
I give you an example, right? I can stand here today with a straight face and say solar energy, PV, is at the verge of being cheap enough to really compete without any help. I would argue one of the good reasons that is true is that Germany, which is certainly not a particularly sunny country, has managed to put enormous policy, subsidies, and effort behind making solar energy cheaper. The fact that there was an enormous learning, an enormous amount of learning by doing in solar, was that the German government said, if you put solar on your roof, you can sell that electricity back to the grid at 50 cents a kilowatt hour. Now we pay 8-9 cents a kilowatt hour here, to put this in perspective. At 50 cents a kilowatt hour, it paid to put solar on my roof. So suddenly lots of people who from an economic perspective, without that help, had no interest doing this, suddenly we're doing it. And as a consequence of this, you really kick-started an industry. And I think something like this has to happen here too. And I would argue you see things happen. 45Q is a new tax rule which just actually explicitly mentions air capture. You can in the US, rather remarkably right now, if you put carbon dioxide underground and you do more than 100,000 tons a year, but within 7 years from now, at the end of that 7 years, you can make $50 a ton of a tax credit to do that. So that actually would allow you to play a scenario. Let's say you do air capture, you get down to $100 a ton. I now put it away in a saline aquifer, like the oil companies would. I get a $50 credit for that. So I'm now down to $50, and we are going to split this between the oil company, who has a real interest to make sure that they can still sell fuel, right? And the customer, who is the volunteer to push the button. I would have to spend about 22, 23 cents a gallon extra for doing that. that actually starts to be affordable. But you need to have things like that in place and start working around it so that things actually happen. My view is how things get cheaper is ultimately by mass production, but that's yet another long story I can discuss. I believe that if you look at a car engine, it costs $10 a kilowatt. The coal-fired power plant, which is sort of considered really cheap, is $1,500 a kilowatt. Gas-fired power plant, these turbines have come down to $300 a kilowatt in capital investment. They are actually going up to $400 or $500, and if they are in combined cycle, they are well above 1,000 too. So how did that car engine get that cheap? It's mass production. We actually analyzed this, we wrote a paper on it. Mass production, I think, will win. So rather than scaling up in size, you scale up in numbers. And so our goal is to build a shipping container sized collector and say that thing can collect about a ton a day. And we are going to have them roll out of factories, if I get my way. And they then are parked where you want it to collect the CO2. Now, if you want to get to 36 billion tons, you would need 100 million of those units. That sounds like a horribly large number, but if they last 10 years, you would have to build 10 million a year. For perspective, we are building 80 million cars and trucks every year, right? And Shanghai Harbor ships out 30 million full shipping containers. So I'm saying the proxy to my machine is now whatever stuff actually fills a real shipping container, which is leaving Shanghai Harbor. So the industrial processing power in the vicinity of Shanghai is actually 3 times larger than what the world as a whole would need to address this problem if it's willing to address it. So I'm arguing if you can get below $100 at the entry point, and then a rough rule of thumb is every time you double your output, the cost drops to roughly 80–85% of where it was before. Solar has done this for 40 years. Computers have done this even longer. And so the question then is, if this technology can do this too, and I can't give you any guarantees, but if that technology does this even too, coming from $300 to $30 is not a big stretch. That's a factor 10, whereas photovoltaic has come down a factor 100, right? And wind is about 50 times cheaper today than it was in the 1960s. So we are at the very beginning. We're not even building a Model T. We are building that first Daimler car, and we are far from having built a Chevy yet, or a Toyota Corolla. And that's where it has to go. Yes?
What about electric vehicles? How much impact would that have?
I am fairly neutral on that. I would make one point. I think they are driven by the observation that it's very hard to deal with your CO2. That's ultimately what makes them really work. I think the electric motor wins out over the internal combustion engine. I think that's becoming clear. By the way, it was clear to Porsche in 1905, right? But then, well, that's a whole long side story. But coming back to this, people still have range anxiety, and when I do comparisons, I'm usually extremely agnostic because I don't know what really will happen. I think we tend to overpredict. It's my private view. But I like to make pairwise comparison and say if I have this option and this option, is one of them obviously better? So I give you option number 1, Tesla 1. We have all beautiful, all electric cars, and they have a lot of batteries in them. And now somebody comes along and say, I replace 2/3 of these batteries with a small electric generator, maybe a fuel cell, maybe an internal combustion engine, maybe a micro turbine. I'm not specifying it, but it needs fuel. Maybe gasoline, maybe methane. Suddenly that same car lost weight, therefore handles better, accelerates better, and has a range of 2,000 miles. Because if that thing could go 300 miles on the batteries, it can now go a couple thousand miles.
Also, solid state storage is upcoming.
Yes, but they are still, a good battery has 0.5 megajoule per kilogram. Gasoline has 50 megatons per kilogram. It's 100 times higher. That's what makes it so powerful. Right? And so I'm arguing, yes, maybe the battery car will win. I think that's actually not unlikely. On the other hand, once you can close the cycle, it's not a foregone conclusion that it will stay that way. But it gets hard for trucks and ships.
They're not appealing to the right market. I drive an electric motorcycle, except I'm a bicycle here.
Yeah.
But, that thing outperforms any other motorcycle.
Yes, but I kept that. I kept that by saying it's actually an electric car.
Yeah.
But I don't need the 400-mile storage in the batteries.
But what I'm saying is they're appealing to the wrong market. They need to appeal to the performance market, which leads.
Which is
to
what Tesla did,
Yeah.
right? And so I think from a performance perspective, the electric motors, 4 motors in each wheel, is probably by far the best option you can have. Now the question is, if I want to drive across the country, should I have a liquid fuel on board to feed my batteries, or do I have to stop every so often and plug in? That's
My answer to that is every restaurant should have a charging station, and it takes an hour to charge it, and that's how long it takes to eat.
yes, but if I have the choice between that and a car, the point is if the CO2 is recaptured, it's okay, right? But there are other issues, and that might tip the balance. For example, if you go through a tunnel, an electric car is much better than than a gasoline-driven car. So you certainly want to have some distance in there. Yes.
Nice, thanks. I have a quick human behavior question for you. So the question is going to be, what's it going to take to get the globe to actually do something? And the assumptions are there's hope, there's a bunch of variety of different things. People don't appreciate risk when it's uncertain, when it's slow, when it's someone else's problem, when it hurts them in their pocketbook, all of the different things that I think we all know. So the question again is, what's it going to take? Is it going to take an island nation to be totally wiped out by the ocean? Is it, because we're a very reactive groups of
Yes.
societies who always want someone else to cure everything.
Yes. So don't give a hoot, don't pollute, right?
Yeah.
You-
Well,
you-
if we could.
And I think that's actually easier than telling people the sky is falling,
Yeah.
right? And so that's, but part of that is, and I think there you see the polarization on both sides.
Yeah.
I'll get in trouble for what I just said because people say, well, then people won't be sustainable, right? And I'm saying, first we have a burning problem. Let's figure that out, right? And then we can figure out how to become all sustainable under all of that. But we are holding, and I actually made this accusation to someone, I said, you're basically holding us hostage for sustainability because you're saying, I'm going to play chicken with that climate change problem until you actually do solve the problem the way we need to solve it. I'm actually saying, from the behavioral perspective, if I could tell you today I can solve this problem for $5 a ton of CO2, we wouldn't be arguing. We would have done it, right? If I tell you it's $1,000 a ton of CO2 to solve the problem, the vast majority will tell me climate change is a hoax, right? And that's because you don't want to hear that answer. So the point I'm pushing on, and I can't get to $5, but maybe I can get to 30 or 50, right? And as I get closer to this number, it becomes easier to convince people. And then I found it actually very interesting coming from New York to here. Here I meet far more people who tell me climate change is not real, right? Than I encountered before. But I found that the very same people I can convince about the fact that every mile they drive puts a pound of CO2 into the atmosphere. And if I just show them a sandbag full of 1 pound of sand, they say, that's what I'm putting in the air, I'm going to fix that. Right? It's the littering problem I can convince somebody of. I cannot convince of the climate change problem. And because it's contaminated with the fact you want me to change my lifestyle, and you are really not about climate change, you're about changing something else. And I had talked with a colleague who also came from the social sciences, and he said, well, we have to do this right. And I accused him, I said, look, you are actually not taking the problem seriously, because if you really believed that the problem could be very bad, you wouldn't play chicken with it. You would grant the middle of the, get out of the middle of the road to your side and let the other car pass, right? And he said, well, I said, I wouldn't work on this if I didn't think that the impacts of climate change could dwarf the upheavals we saw for other reasons in the 20th century. And he said, you really mean that this could be as bad as what we saw with Hitler and Stalin and World War I and World War II? And I said, if I didn't think that, I wouldn't waste my time on this problem. I'm not telling you I can guarantee you that it will be that bad, but it certainly is within the possible range. And therefore, I don't want to play chicken with the problem. And I say, behavioral problems are very difficult. And if the more I can push them aside, the better off I am. And coming from science, I'm very simple-minded. I say, you have a big control box. We are shoving in carbon on one side. We better take it out on the other side, otherwise the book is not balanced. Right? And right now, we already shoved in too much. So the discussion is not anymore we have to match the input to the output. We have to take the excess, which is already in there, out. And I don't think we have all that much choice anymore, because we painted ourselves into this corner.
Thank you, that was a great answer.
And the last answer. Thank you, Klaus.
I'll keep you here all day.